India just went from launching satellites to dreaming of building cities in space. In 2014, India had just one space startup, but today there are nearly 250, and they're doing everything from building reusable rockets to planning asteroid mining. And it's not just ambition, India is actually delivering. In 2024, we saw private rockets take flight, satellite constellations go live, and deep-pocketed investors finally betting big on Indian space tech. But here's the twist, this isn't a story about catching up with the United States or China. This is about how India is quietly creating its own space tech revolution with lower costs, faster launches, and a government that's throwing its full weight behind private players. And so in this video, we're going to be breaking down how India is building the future of space startup by startup, rocket by rocket, and why the world should be paying attention. In 1963, in a tiny fishing village called Tumba, India launched its first ever rocket. And there were no fancy launch pads, no billion-dollar budgets, just a handful of scientists, a church-turned laboratory, and a rocket so small that it was actually transported on a bicycle. And this was the beginning of ISRO, led by Dr. Vikram Sarabhai, who believed space wasn't a luxury for rich nations, it was a necessity for India's development. His vision was to use space technology for education, communication, and disaster management, and not just for prestige. By 1975, India had built Aryabhatta, its first satellite, and in 1980, India launched its first indigenous rocket. And in 2014, India stunned the world with Mangalyaan, reaching Mars at a cost cheaper than making a Hollywood movie. But while ISRO led the way, private players were locked out, not by accident, but by design. Space was strategic, and only the government controlled launches. Yet behind the scenes, ISRO had quietly built an ecosystem of over 500 Indian vendors, from aerospace giants to small manufacturers supplying critical components for rockets and satellites. And that ecosystem thrived for decades, but full privatization, well, that only came in 2020 with InSpace, allowing startups like Skyroot, Bellatrix, and Pixel to finally build and launch their own missions. And now India's space tech revolution is just getting started. Today, India's space economy is worth $15 billion, which might sound impressive, but in the grand scheme of things, it's just 2% of the global market. But that is changing fast. By 2030, India's space sector could grow to $77 billion, capturing up to 8% of the global space market. But what's truly remarkable is that this growth is not just coming from ISRO anymore. 13 years ago, India had just one space startup, Dhruva Space, but today there are nearly 250 building rockets, satellites, imaging systems, and orbital infrastructure. When an industry is growing at this speed, investment is bound to follow. And since 2020, private investor into India's space sector has crossed $350 million. But where's all this money going? What are the biggest opportunities, and which startups are leading this transformation? Well, when people think about space, they imagine rockets, astronauts, and missions to Mars, but space is so much more than that. The real money is actually in solving commercial problems, things that impact businesses, industries, and even daily life on Earth. And to simplify things, India's space economy is largely divided into two major segments. The first is upstream. This is the part of the industry that focuses on getting things up to space. It includes rockets, satellites, and launch vehicles, and according to this INC42 report, by 2030, India's upstream space market is expected to grow to $25 billion. And right now, this is where most of the Indian space tech startups are getting funded. But the other segment is downstream, and this is where space data is used to solve real-world problems. It includes applications in agriculture, defense, climate monitoring, logistics, and disaster management. And unlike upstream, this subsector has actually received the least funding so far, but it's expected to be worth $52 billion by 2030, which means that it's going to make up the largest chunk of India's space economy in the future. Now, both of these areas present massive opportunities, and Indian startups are tackling the industry's biggest challenges in both. So let's first talk about the upstream side of the industry. The biggest bottleneck in space is actually getting there is pretty expensive. And it's not just about the total cost, it's actually about how much you're paying per kilogram. So let me explain that. When a big satellite is launched on SpaceX's Falcon 9, it costs around $97 million, which sounds like a lot, but because the rocket can carry as much as 22,800 800 kilograms of weight into space, the cost actually comes down to about $4,254 per kilo, which is actually pretty cheap in the space world. But here's the catch. This rocket is used for launching large satellites, and most companies aren't launching large satellites. In fact, in 2023, 97% of all satellites launched were small satellites. And so for smaller satellites, the numbers look a lot worse. Take, for example, Rocket Lab's Electron rocket. It's designed for smaller missions, and a single launch costs around $7.5 million. But because it carries less weight, only about 300 kilograms, the cost per kilo jumps up to $25,000. That's nearly 6.5 times more expensive than SpaceX's Falcon 9 just to send the same amount of stuff into space. And money isn't the only issue here. Time is also a problem. So if you're launching a small satellite, you often have to wait up to 18 months just to find a spot on a shared rocket because those missions get booked up years in advance. So for small and medium satellite companies, the real problem is that it's expensive, it's slow, and the process is inflexible. And so that's where Indian startups are coming in. They're building rockets that are cheaper, faster to launch, and made just for smaller satellites. For decades, India's space launches were controlled by ISRO. So if you wanted to launch a satellite, you had to wait for ISRO's schedule. But then Skyroot Aerospace changed everything. In November of 2022, Skyroot launched Vikram S, making it the first private company in India to launch their own rocket into space. And their next rocket, Vikram 1, is a small satellite launch vehicle designed to carry payloads of up to 500 kilograms. It's reusable, which could cut satellite launch costs by 50%. And Skyroot's goal is simple: make India one of the cheapest places in the world to launch satellites. And they've already raised $95.1 million, making them India's most well-funded space startup. Now, Skyroot is focused on reusability, but what if you could 3D print an entire rocket engine? Well, that's exactly what Agnikul Cosmos is doing. Their Agnilet engine is India's first 3D printed rocket engine. It is fully 3D printed, by the way. It has no joints and no welds, meaning fewer failure points. This technology allows for custom-built rockets for different types of payloads, faster turnaround times, rockets built in months instead of years, and lower costs by reducing material waste. Now, Agnikul isn't just experimenting here. Their first commercial orbit launch is set for this year, 2025, and if it succeeds, they will be the first company in Asia, not just India, but Asia, to launch a fully 3D printed rocket, and they've raised $61 million so far. Now, getting satellites into orbit is one thing, but keeping them in the right orbit, preventing collisions, and extending their lifespan is another challenge entirely. Satellites in space today have very limited mobility, and so once launched, they can't easily change their orbit, meaning that if they're deployed in the wrong place, they are stuck there forever. Bellatrix Aerospace is solving this problem with Pushback, an orbital transfer vehicle, an OTV, essentially a space tow truck that can move satellites into perfect orbit. And this is important because it extends satellite lifespans, prevents costly replacements, and reduces space debris. And that's why Bellatrix Aerospace has been able to raise $11 million so far, plus R&D grants from both ISRO and BASF. Now, the other part of this industry is where space creates real economic value, and that's the downstream segment. And as I've said, even though startups operating in this space subsector have raised the least amount of money so far, this is actually the biggest space market for Indian startups, at least in the future. One of the biggest challenges here is that satellite images today lack detail, making them difficult to use for applications like precision farming, environmental monitoring, and disaster response. And so Pixel is solving this with their hyperspectral imaging satellites. Their satellites can spot crop diseases before they spread, they can track illegal mining and deforestation, they can detect underground water sources, and here's the thing, NASA is already a customer of this company. Pixel just signed a multi-million-dollar deal to provide them with hyperspectral satellite data, and they've also raised $95 million so far. So with Indian startups tackling pretty much every major challenge, from reducing launch costs to unlocking the power of satellite data, India is no longer playing catch-up. It's building its own lane. But how does India stack up against other countries that are racing to capture this same opportunity? Well, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. While the United States and China dominate the global space market, India's most relevant competitors right now aren't just the giants, they're countries on a similar trajectory. And so there's two two nations that have similarly sized space industries, and these are Japan and Iran. Both of these countries are investing in their private space sectors, and both are betting big on startups. But their approaches and progress look very different, so let's break it down. First of all, we'll start with Japan. Its space industry is far older than India's. The Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, that's JAXA, has been launching missions ever since the 1970s. However, like India, Japan's private space sector only gained momentum recently. The Japanese space economy is worth around $26 billion, and the government plans to double this industry to $52 billion by the early 2030s. The country is investing heavily in private players, with major corporations like Toyota backing space tech startups. Some of Japan's most exciting private space startups include Interstellar Technologies, which is aiming to develop cost-effective small satellite launchers with backing from Toyota. Their Zero rocket is expected to make its first orbital launch in 2025, and then there's also Space One, which is focused on small satellite launches using the Kairos rocket, Japan's first private spaceport, and plans for 20 launches per year by the end of the 2020s. Japan's private space startups are mostly focused on satellite launches, similar to India. However, Japan's involvement in high-tech and corporate-backed space innovation gives it a bit of a different edge. But if you look at the number of launches done by Japan and India in 2024, they are pretty evenly placed. Okay, so now let's talk about Iran. Iran's space industry is primarily government-controlled, with the Iranian Space Agency leading its efforts since its formation in 2004. And even though their space program is fairly new and has a much lower budget than India's, they actually managed to pull off almost as many launches in 2024 as India, showing how much progress they've made in a short span of time. And then in 2024, Iran's first privately developed satellites, Goswar and Hodhod, were launched by Omid Faza Company. So Iran's space sector is still in its early private phase, and they're mainly focused on satellite development rather than launches, while India and Japan have multiple startups working on rocket launches and space mobility, whereas Iran's focus remains on communications and Earth observation satellites. So how does India compare to these two countries? Well, India currently stands between Japan and Iran in terms of private sector involvement and market growth. So unlike Iran, India has a strong private launch industry with companies like Skyroot and Agnikul. While Japan's startups are heavily corporate-backed though, India's startups are more independent and venture-funded. And it's also worth noting that India's space tech economy is already quite a bit bigger than Iran's and growing at a faster rate than Japan's. Both Japan and Iran are making progress, but India is emerging as the strongest private space tech player outside of the United States and China. Okay, so now let's finally talk about the United States. The US space story began in 1958 when NASA was founded in response to the Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik, and for decades, space was the government's exclusive playground. But by the 1980s, it became clear that the pace and cost of government-only space exploration was unsustainable. And so that's when the Commercial Space Launch Act of 1984 was introduced, legally opening the door for private companies to build and operate their own rockets. But the real turning point came in the 2000s. NASA, recognizing the potential of commercial innovation, launched COTS, that's the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services Program, inviting private players like SpaceX and Orbital Sciences to develop cargo missions to the ISS. And this was followed by the Commercial Crew Program, which gave companies like SpaceX and Boeing contracts to develop human-rated spacecraft. And fast forward to today, and the United States space economy is worth over $200 billion, accounting for about 40% of the global space market. With the space industry projected to hit $1 trillion by 2030, the United States could command a $400 billion market, driven not just by NASA's $25 billion budget, but by a thriving private sector too. In 2024, the United States conducted 158 orbital launches, and 132 of them were by SpaceX's Falcon 9 alone. That's more than many countries have done in their entire space history. And it doesn't stop at launches. The United States leads in satellite manufacturing, Earth imaging, navigation services, and even space space tourism, with companies like Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic already flying private citizens into suborbital space. And then, of course, there are the milestones that reshaped the industry. In 2008, SpaceX's Falcon 1 became the first privately developed liquid-fueled rocket to reach Earth's orbit. In 2012, Dragon became the first commercial spacecraft to deliver cargo to the International Space Station. And then in 2020, Crew Dragon launched astronauts, marking the first time a private company sent humans into orbit. But perhaps the most disruptive innovation has been reusability. With Falcon 9's booster landing in 2015 and routine reuse afterwards, launch costs fell from roughly $10,000 per kilo to under $3,000 per kilo, and that's how satellite launches became as frequent and as affordable as they are today. Now let's talk about Starlink. It's the largest satellite constellation in orbit, with over 7,000 satellites delivering global broadband. And meanwhile, Rocket Lab, Firefly Aerospace, and Blue Origin are each building their own niche, from small sat launches to lunar missions. So what's made this possible is the shift into NASA's role. It moved from builder to buyer, contracting private companies for services rather than running missions itself. That one structural change has allowed the private sector to thrive, and the United States has built the most mature commercial space ecosystem on Earth as a result. So in a way, you could say that the United States led by stepping back, but China has actually done the opposite, keeping a firm grip on the controls while slowly inviting private players to participate in its strategic vision. China's modern space program is run by the China National Space Administration, established in 1993. So for decades, the entire ecosystem, from rocket launches to deep space missions, was operated by a few massive state-owned corporations like CASC and CASIC. But things began to change in 2014 when China officially allowed private companies to enter the space sector. While most of these companies still operate under the government's shadow, the move sparked the birth of a commercial ecosystem that is scaling up fast and delivering results. In 2025, China spent $14 billion in annual government spending, and the ambition doesn't stop there. China's space economy is driven by everything from mega constellations and Earth observation satellites to moon missions and space stations. In 2024, China conducted 68 orbital launches, making it the second most active launch country after the United States. And while many of these were state-run, private players are increasingly contributing to this count, showing they're becoming reliable and scalable. Satellite manufacturing is another area of rapid growth. China is racing to build LEO mega constellations, with companies like G-Space and Galaxy Space aiming to challenge Starlink by launching thousands of small satellites for global broadband and Earth monitoring. China is also expanding aggressively in deep space. It became the first country to land a rover on the far side of the moon, successfully landed a rover on Mars, and has also set its sights on a crewed moon mission by the 2030s. Meanwhile, China's private space companies, though young, are hitting key milestones at breakneck speed. Landspace became the first in the world to launch a methane-fueled rocket to orbit with the Zhuge 2 in 2023. Galactic Energy has achieved multiple successful orbital launches with its Series 1 rocket, becoming one of the most reliable small launch companies in China. iSpace in 2019 became the first private Chinese company to reach orbit, breaking a barrier that even many older space nations haven't crossed. And then there's also X-Space, which operates in a commercial capacity under the umbrella of a state-owned entity and focuses on solid fuel launch systems aimed especially at the growing small sat market. Just like the United States, China is now testing reusable rockets and building regional space clusters in cities like Beijing, Wuhan, and Shanghai, where startups benefit from R&D support, funding, and government procurement. Now, the biggest difference, of course, here is the model. China's space economy is still very much top-down. The government sets the roadmap, allocates funding, and even guides where and how private companies should innovate. But within those parameters, it's created room for a thriving commercial sector that is now entering global markets, exporting launch services, and expanding its geopolitical footprint in space. And for a country that didn't even have private space companies a decade ago, China has come a long way. It's moving pretty quickly. And while it may not yet match the commercial maturity of the United States, its pace, scale, and government coordination make it a serious global contender. So, as we wrap things up here today, let's turn our attention back to the subject of this video. India's space tech industry is in the midst of transformation, driven by strong government backing and a new wave of private startups that are entering the space economy. With an ambitious ambitious goal of increasing its share in the global space market from 2% to 8% by 2033, India is aggressively opening up its space sector, introducing policies, funding mechanisms, and infrastructure support that are shaping its future as a space superpower. Now, to manage this transformation, the government created InSpace, short for the Indian National Space Promotion and Authorization Center. InSpace was designed to be a single window agency that didn't just regulate private space activity, it actually promoted it. InSpace would also grant clearances to facilitate access to ISRO's world-class infrastructure and became the much-needed bridge between the government and a growing private ecosystem. The impact, of course, was very significant. In 2014, India had just one space startup, Dhruva Space, but by 2025, that number had grown to nearly 250 startups, working on everything from launch vehicles and satellites to space-based applications for agriculture, defense, and disaster management. But the government didn't stop at just deregulation. It put its money where its mouth was. In 2025, India announced the Technology Adoption Fund, a 500 crore rupee, which is about $60 million initiative to help startups bridge the dreaded valley of death between R&D and commercial viability. Startups could get 60% of their project costs covered, while more established players could receive up to 40%. Alongside that, the government also launched a 1,000 crore rupee, that's about $120 million venture capital fund, specifically for space tech startups. By the end of 2024, 18 early-stage startups had already received funding, and 14 of them had successfully completed orbital launches. India also reworked its foreign direct investment rules to make the sector more attractive for global investors, and so as of 2024, 100% FDI is allowed in satellite manufacturing, 74% FDI is permitted in satellite services and ground infrastructure, and up to 49% FDI is allowed in launch vehicles and spaceport operations. These bold reforms have had a ripple effect. Since 2020, over $350 million has been invested in Indian space tech startups. Venture capital is flowing, global partnerships are being forged, and India is starting to look like a serious contender on the global space tech stage. But building rockets and satellites is only part of the puzzle. The government also focused on infrastructure, making sure startups had places to test, assemble, and launch. New space parks are coming up in states like Kerala and Karnataka, offering subsidized access to testing, integration, and fabrication facilities. And these hubs are not just real estate, they're accelerators of innovation. The government is also streamlining approvals in the Indian Space Policy of 2023, making it easier for private companies to build, launch, and operate their own space assets without being buried under red tape. And ISRO has been a huge collaborator here. The space agency now outsources up to 80% of PSLV production to private vendors, forming a robust public-private partnership model that mirrors what NASA has done with SpaceX and other companies. So where exactly is India focusing its energy? Well, the government has identified three core verticals: launch vehicles, satellites, and space applications. In launch vehicles, India is capitalizing on one of the biggest pain points in the global space industry: high launch costs and long wait times. Startups like Skyroot Aerospace and Agnikul Cosmos are stepping in with low-cost, rapid launch rockets that undercut global competitors by up to 50%. And these aren't just prototypes, they're already flying and attracting international attention. And then in satellite manufacturing, India has launched over 430 foreign satellites till date, and the goal is to become a global hub for small sat production. Dhruva Space, for example, has managed to bring down satellite production time from 3 to 4 years to just 18 months, a feat that has major implications for both domestic and global clients. And then, of course, there's space data and applications, a segment projected to be worth $52 billion for India by 2030. And this is where companies like Pixel are making waves. By developing hyperspectral imaging satellites, Pixel can provide incredibly detailed Earth observation data, something with huge implications for climate monitoring, precision agriculture, and even defense surveillance. And all of this positions India as a low-cost, high-efficiency alternative to the United States and China, helping Indian startups to attract clients from Europe, Australia, and Southeast Asia. The government of India isn't just enabling a space economy, it's actively building one, brick by brick, booster by booster. And if the past 5 years are any indication, the next decade could see India transform from an efficient launch pad to a global space superpower. By the way, the next generation of Indian space tech startups already have much bigger ambitions. They're thinking beyond just satellites and traditional launch vehicles. Startups like InSpacity are working on building space habitats and orbital cities, imagining a future where humans don't just visit space, they actually live in space. Owais Ahmed, the co-founder of Pixel, is already working on hyperspectral Earth imaging, but his long-term vision is asteroid mining, extracting resources from space to fuel Earth's industries and probably even provide fuel for space cities. And then there's Ethereal X, a startup developing India's first fully reusable rocket, aiming to bring down launch costs and make frequent space access a reality. And then there's also Orbitaid, which is focusing on space debris mitigation and creating tech to clean up Earth's orbits and make space sustainable. These aren't just moonshot ideas, they're being built right now, and they signal one thing: the future of Indian space tech isn't just catching up, it's preparing to lead.